Imagine shrinking down,
Hmm.
way, way down, past a skin cell, past the mitochondria, all the way down to the nanoscale. If you were standing on a human hand at that scale, you wouldn't see skin. You'd see a jungle.
Oh, a very crowded, very aggressive jungle.
Billions of organisms fighting, feeding, reproducing. I mean, it's arguably the most complex ecosystem on Earth, and it's happening right on top of us.
He really is.
And today we are taking a deep dive into the rules of that jungle.
Specifically, we're diving into Chapter 1 of Lippincott Illustrated Reviews, Microbiology. And look, I know Chapter 1 can sound like the boring part you have to get through before the cool diseases.
Right, before you get to the plague or Ebola.
Exactly.
Okay.
But this is, and I'm not exaggerating, probably the most critical chapter in the entire book.
Because you can't diagnose the disease if you don't know who the suspect is.
Precisely. This chapter is the roadmap. It classifies that entire invisible world, the bacteria, viruses, fungi, parasites, and it explains the rules of engagement between them and us. If you don't get the classification right, you can't possibly get the treatment right.
It's the whole framework.
The framework for every single clinical decision you'll make in infectious disease.
Okay, so let's start with the relationship status. It's complicated. I think a lot of us assume that if a microbe is on you, you're infected. Full stop.
That is the single biggest misconception, and we need to clear it up right away. Lippincott has this great flowchart, figure 1.1, and it draws a hard line between colonization, infection, and disease. There are three totally different things.
Okay, walk us through that. Colonization is just them being there.
Think of it as setting up camp. A microbe lands on your skin or your mucous membranes, and it establishes a territory. It reproduces. But, and this is the key, it isn't hurting you. In fact, your resident flora, the good bacteria, they're all colonizers. They take up all the parking spaces so the bad guys can't pull in.
So it's actually defensive sometimes. It's like having a full house so no unwanted guests can crash the party.
That's a perfect analogy.
But then the chart moves on to infection.
Right. Infection is when the dynamic shifts. The organism starts multiplying, and the host, your body, notices. The immune system wakes up.
The alarm goes off.
The alarm is tripped. White blood cells are moving in. Antibodies are being produced. There's a battle starting.
But you can be infected and not even feel sick.
Absolutely.
Right.
And that's the crucial distinction between infection and infectious disease. Disease only happens when the organism causes actual tissue damage or, it messes with how your body functions.
Yeah.
You can have an infection where your immune system just wins so quickly you never feel a single symptom.
The text mentions a specific outcome here that feels really important for public health, the carrier state.
The typhoid Mary scenario. This is so dangerous clinically because the person feels fine.
Yeah.
They have zero symptoms, but they're actively shedding the organism.
They're a silent reservoir.
A silent reservoir.
Yeah.
From a doctor's perspective, these are the hardest patients to spot because they don't look sick.
Wow. That distinction alone between just carrying the bug and actually suffering from it, that feels like a really crucial mental model to have.
It is. I mean, if you culture a wound and find some bacteria, you have to ask, is this bug causing the problem, or is it just living there? Treating colonization with heavy antibiotics is often a huge mistake.
Okay, so we've defined the battlefield. Now let's meet the combatants. The chapter draws this hard line right at the start. The division between prokaryotes and eukaryotes.
The great divide of biology. And if you take one thing away from this whole deep dive, let it be figure 1.2. It's this comparison table that looks, a bit dry.
A little academic.
A little academic, but it's actually the secret to all of pharmacology.
Why is this one table so high yield?
Because it explains why antibiotics work. I mean, think about it. We want to swallow a pill that kills a bacterium, but leaves our own cells completely untouched. How do you do that?
You have to find a difference.
You have to exploit the differences. We are eukaryotes. We have complex cells, a nucleus protecting our DNA, all these organelles like mitochondria. Bacteria are prokaryotes. They're much simpler. No nucleus, no organelles. Their DNA is just sort of floating around.
And the text points to a few specific targets in that table. Ribosomes seem to be a really big one.
Huge. Ribosomes are the cell's protein factories. We have them. Bacteria have them. Everybody needs protein. But they're different sizes.
Right. 80S for us, 70S for them.
And it sounds like such a minor detail, 70 versus 80. But pharmacologically, it is everything.
It's the whole game.
It's the difference between a square peg and a round hole. We can design a drug, something like erythromycin, that literally jams the gears of a 70S ribosome, but it just bounces right off our 80S ones. We shut down their factory while ours keeps humming along.
Then there's the cell wall.
Another massive target. Our human cells are well, they're squishy. We have a plasma membrane, no hard wall. Most bacteria have this rigid cell wall made of something called peptidoglycan. It's like you're wearing a suit of armor.
And drugs like penicillin, they attack that armor.
They stop the bacteria from building it in the first place. And if you can't build your wall, you basically pop and die from osmotic pressure. Since we don't have peptidoglycan, penicillin is incredibly safe for us. It targets a structure we just don't have.
The text also brings up the sheer scale of these things in figure 1.3. It's a logarithmic scale, which really puts it in perspective.
It helps visualize the hierarchy, yeah. At the very bottom, you have prions, just misfolded proteins, barely a blip. Then viruses.
Yeah.
Then bacteria. And then way up top, you have eukaryotic cells like ours. We're the giants. A bacterium next to a human cell is like a cat next to a house.
So let's zoom in on those cats for a minute. The bacteria. The text splits them into typical and atypical. When we say typical bacteria, what are we looking at?
You're looking for a bug that plays by the rules. It's got a rigid cell wall, a specific shape. The book lists spheres, which are cocci, rods, bacilli, or corkscrews, the spear sheds. You can stain them with a Gram stain, see if they turn purple or red, and classify them pretty quickly.
They also have these interesting accessories mentioned, plasmids.
Plasmids are fascinating
Yeah.
and honestly a little terrifying. They're these small, extra circles of DNA that exist outside the main chromosome.
Okay.
Think of them like a USB drive that a bacterium can carry. And on that drive are special codes, usually for things like antibiotic resistance or how to make a nasty toxin.
And they can just share these USB drives.
Yes, a resistant bacterium can pull up next to a non-resistant one and just hand over a copy of the plasmid. Suddenly you've got two resistant bacteria. It's a peer-to-peer network for sharing weapons.
Wow. That explains why resistance can spread so terrifyingly fast in a hospital.
And that's totally separate from their normal reproductions, which is just binary fission splitting in two.
Okay, so what about the atypical bacteria? The rebels, as the text seems to imply.
Right, these are the bugs that don't follow the standard rules. We're talking about things like Mycoplasma, Chlamydia, and Rickettsia.
How are they different?
Well, take Mycoplasma. It's famous because it completely lacks a cell wall.
So penicillin would be totally useless.
Completely useless. You can't break a wall that isn't even there. And that's why recognizing something as atypical immediately changes your prescription. You can't treat walking pneumonia, which is often Mycoplasma, with a standard penicillin. You need a different tool.
And then you have Chlamydia and Rickettsia, which are weird for a different reason. The text calls them obligate intracellular parasites.
Which just means they have to live inside one of our cells to survive.
Yeah.
They're almost like viruses in that way, but they're still bacteria. They've just lost the metabolic machinery to make it on their own out in the open.
Okay, let's move up the size scale. We're eukaryotes, but not all eukaryotes are friendly. We have fungi, protozoa, and helminths.
And this is where treatment gets a lot trickier. Remember that selective toxicity idea? Finding a difference to target.
Yeah.
Well, fungi and parasites are eukaryotes, just like us. Their machinery, their ribosomes, their membranes, it's all much more similar to ours.
Which means it's harder to find a drug that kills them without also hurting us.
Exactly. The side effects for antifungal and antiparasitic drugs tend to be a lot harsher because that biological gap is just so much smaller.
Fungi's pretty straightforward. The text mentions yeasts and molds.
Right. Yeasts are single-celled, molds are filamentous like threads. They're supposed to eat dead organic matter. But when they decide to eat living organic matter, it can be anything from a mild case of athlete's foot to a life-threatening systemic infection.
Then protozoa.
Single-celled eukaryotes, a lot of them are harmless, just swimming around in ponds. But the parasitic ones, they're nasty. This is the group that includes Plasmodium, which causes malaria, and other organisms that cause dysentery.
And finally, the helminths, which is just a nightmare.
The worms, tapeworms, flukes, roundworms. Yeah, these aren't microscopic specks. These are multicellular animals living inside of you. They have digestive tracts, reproductive systems.
I think we can glide right past that mental image and get to the last group. The group that isn't even technically alive. The viruses.
The ultimate minimalists. A virus is not a cell. It has no nucleus, no organelles, no cytoplasm. It is just a packet of genetic information, either DNA or RNA, never both, wrapped in a protein box called a capsid.
They're obligate intracellular parasites, just like chlamydia.
But even more so, they're hackers. They carry the blueprint, but they have no construction crew, no tools, no factory. They have to break into your cell, hijack your ribosomes and your enzymes, and force your cell to build copies of the virus.
And that process usually destroys the host cell.
Very often, yes. The cell fills up with new virus particles until it bursts. That's called lysis. Or sometimes the virus particles just bleed out slowly over time. Either way, the cell stops doing its job and becomes a virus factory.
The text also makes a big deal about the envelope. Some viruses have one, some don't.
It's basically a disguise. When an enveloped virus leaves your cell, it steals a piece of your cell membrane to wrap around itself. That's the envelope.
Okay.
It helps them fuse with the next cell, but, and this is the paradox, it actually makes them weaker out in the environment.
Weaker. You'd think an extra layer would be more protection.
You would, but that membrane is made of lipids, of fat. It dries out easily.
Correct.
It's vulnerable to detergents, to alcohol, to stomach acid.
Yeah.
So enveloped viruses like HIV or the flu, they need wet, direct transmission.
And the naked ones.
The ones without the envelope are just tough little protein boxes. They can survive on a doorknob for days.
That's a great practical tip. Hand sanitizer works because it destroys that lipid envelope.
Right.
Okay, so we have our cast of characters: bacteria, fungi, parasites, viruses. But when I look at figures 1.6 and 1.7 in the book, the sheer number of names it's overwhelming. Staphylococcus, Clostridium, adenovirus.
It's a lot. And this is where students start to panic. They try to memorize it all like a phone book. But the text makes a really smart point here. Don't memorize a list. Build a mental shelf.
The list format.
Yes. The text says that for a clinician, the list format is the most high-yield tool. In the real world, you don't start with the name of the bug. You start with the category. You have to triage the suspect.
Let's build that shelf for the listener right now. Step 1. Is it bacteria or a virus? Let's say it's bacteria.
Okay, bacteria. First split, gram-positive or gram-negative. That's the first result you'll get from the lab.
Let's start with the gram-positives.
Now, divide by shape. Are they spheres, the cocci, or are they rods, the bacilli? If they are gram-positive cocci, you are almost certainly dealing with Staphylococcus or Streptococcus.
And that covers a huge range of infections right there. Skin infections, strep throat.
Pneumonia, exactly. You just narrowed the field from thousands of possibilities down to 2 main families.
Okay, what if they're gram-positive rods?
Think spore formers. This is the Clostridium family, so tetanus, botulism, C. diff, and also anthrax and listeria. These are really hardy bugs you find in soil and food.
All right, let's switch sides. Gram-negatives.
Same split. Gram-negative cocci, that's a really short list. It's almost always Neisseria. That's your cause for meningitis and gonorrhea.
But the gram-negative rods, that list in figure 1.6 looks huge.
It's the biggest shelf. This is the whole enteric group, the gut bugs. E. coli, Salmonella, Shigella, but it's also the nasty respiratory bugs like Pseudomonas and Klebsiella. If your patient has a gut problem or a hospital-acquired infection, you are hunting on this shelf.
And then tucked away are the spirochetes.
The corkscrews, syphilis and Lyme disease, they just don't fit neatly into the other buckets.
And the atypicals we talked about before.
Exactly. Mycoplasma, Chlamydia, Mycobacterium for TB.
It really does make it manageable when you group them like that. It's not 500 names. It's like 4 or 5 neighborhoods of bacteria.
That's the key. And you do the same thing for viruses, which is figure 1.7. But the shelving system is different. You don't stain them, you ask. Is it a DNA virus or an RNA virus?
So DNA viruses, who's on that list?
These tend to be the chronic latent ones. So the whole herpes family, herpes simplex, chickenpox, mono, also hepatitis B and smallpox.
And the RNA viruses.
Those are often the fast movers. Influenza, measles, mumps, rabies, Ebola, and of course retroviruses like HIV.
The text gets pretty technical, mentioning positive strand and negative strand for RNA viruses. Is that important for the big picture?
For a microbiologist? Absolutely. For a general understanding, just know that RNA viruses are, as a rule, much more prone to mutation. Think about why the flu changes every single year. DNA viruses are way more stable.
That's a fantastic heuristic. DNA is stable. RNA is chaotic.
Generally, yeah. And notice on that chart, they also split them by enveloped versus non-enveloped. Again, that tells you immediately about transmission. An enveloped RNA virus like the flu needs droplets. A non-enveloped DNA virus like adenovirus can live on a towel.
This chapter really is the periodic table of medicine, isn't it? You can't do chemistry without the elements, and you can't do infectious disease without these lists.
It's the vocabulary. Once you know that Clostridium is a gram-positive spore-forming rod, you instantly know it lives in the soil, it's hard to kill, and it probably makes toxins. You know the story before you even see the patient.
So if we had to distill this entire deep dive down to 3 main takeaways for someone listening, what would they be?
Okay, first, context is everything. The presence of a bug is not the same as disease. Colonization is normal, infection is a reaction, disease is damage. Don't treat a lab result, treat the patient.
That one alone could stop a lot of unnecessary antibiotic use. Number 2.
Structure dictates survival. The whole reason we can cure bacterial pneumonia but struggle with, say, fungal infections or viruses comes down to cellular structure. We exploit the differences, the cell wall, the 7ds ribosome. When the structures are too similar to ours, our weapons are limited.
And the 3rd.
Taxonomy is a tool, not a trivia game. Organizing all these organisms by gram stain, shape, and genome isn't just busy work. It's a rapid sorting algorithm for your brain. It narrows the suspect list from thousands to a handful in minutes. Use figures 1.6 and 1.7 as your map.
It's funny, we've just been casually mentioning names like Yersinia pestis and smallpox. But looking at these lists, it's basically a who's who of human usury.
It is. Every single organism on those lists has shaped human history. They've toppled empires, decided wars, evolved right alongside us. This chapter just introduces the characters. The rest of the book and our future deep dives will tell the stories of what happens when those characters decide to attack.
A terrifying but fascinating preview. We will leave the specific pathologies for next time. Thanks for helping us navigate this invisible jungle.
My pleasure. Wash your hands.
Always. This has been a last-minute lecture deep dive. Thanks for listening and keep learning.